All right. Wow. So, for a year back in college, before I decided I wanted to study art, I thought I was going to be a geologist. And during that year, I took this mineralogy class where we studied crystals and their structures and physical properties. And I learned that to a mineralogist, symmetry means a very particular thing. It's this specific organizational system by which structures like crystals can order themselves. And a mineralogist would tell you that you build a symmetrical structure by starting out with like a base unit or a foundational building block, and then you repeat it in relation to one fixed point or axis or plane. And so we can illustrate this point by imagining an ink blot test. So you've got a smear of ink on one side of the page, and then you fold the paper and you squish it into the other side. And then when you unfold it, you reveal this symmetrical structure that you've just created. And in one way of seeing it's this image of two opposites, right? It's like the left-handed version of this right-handed original. But then in another way of seeing it's this cohesive whole, this symmetrical structure that's built out of two units, but they're put into relation to each other by being oriented towards that same central fold. And so I realize this is sort of an abstract way to start the talk out, but when I was thinking about what I wanted to say and how I could say it, I kept coming back around to this like mineralogist's understanding of symmetry, and realizing that it formed a pretty good foundation for a metaphor that I wanted to try to build with you all. And so I wanted to make sure we had like a shared language around symmetry, or at least like a shared mental image. So hang on to that idea of symmetry as this way to build structures out of individual units by putting them all in relation to one fixed common point. That's sort of the idea. For the rest of the talk, I'm going to ask y'all to indulge me in a bit of autobiography. I want to relate two little vignettes from my life from two distinct chapters, and then use those vignettes to build out this symmetry metaphor, and hopefully move on to an emotionally and intellectually satisfying conclusion. I've never done this before, so it could go off the rails, but I feel pretty warm and fuzzy in this crowd, so we're in it together, I guess. So, chapter one. The first vignette comes from a chapter in my life that started about 10 years ago, when I first moved down to North Carolina to study pottery, to do a pottery apprenticeship. I'd been studying pottery in school, and I knew I wanted to keep doing it, but I wasn't really clear what that looked like. And serendipitously, around that time, I came across this article about a potter in North Carolina who was making beautiful work in this particular historic lineage, and he was using these kind of gritty, timeless methods to make the work, firing all the pots in this big wood-burning kiln, and digging all of the clay locally to make the work, which the geologist in me loved. And furthermore, the article was just kind of dripping with all the sorts of romance that I was really craving at that time in my life. So I moved down and signed up, and for the next 3 years, I really did live this pretty dreamy, meditative lifestyle where I literally chopped wood and carried water and got to focus wholeheartedly on learning this craft alongside this very capable teacher. And one of the aspects of that teaching relationship that I really appreciate in retrospect, thinking back, is just the luxurious amount of shared time and experience that's built into that, where you can imagine you're doing the same thing day in, day out with a person for 3 years straight. Like, you're going to have a lot of opportunity for conversation. And I remember having a conversation with my teacher Daniel one morning that arose organically, where we basically got off on riffing on the topic of what it meant to be an artist. Pretty heady stuff, but and he offered up this image to make his point that he was putting forth at that point, and I wanted to relate the image to y'all because I think it's a useful way to digest a lot of things. But so the image is simple. It's just that there are two birds up in a tree, and one of the birds is very vigorously and actively going about eating the fruit of the tree. It's hopping from branch to branch, and it's like its little beak is smeared red with berry juice, and it's just this kind of strenuous creature in general. But by contrast, the other bird is very still and very quiet, and it doesn't eat at all. It's there just watching. And I looked it up later. Turns out this little parable comes from the Upanishads. It's one of the foundational texts of Hinduism. And I'm not a religious scholar, but to me you can interpret this as a really lovely metaphor for the self. You know, we have this aspect of our lives that is embodied and physical. You know, we are bound to the world around us by the urges of our physical body. We're hungry and so we must eat, you know, that's the idea. And then there's this other aspect to the self that some folks might identify with that is somehow removed from that, a bit detached from that. And it stands apart and it observes, and it's there to make meaning. You know, it's kind of like the soul, or however you want to put it. So it's a lovely image that I come back to a lot. But that morning, Daniel and I were talking about what it meant to be an artist, right? And he was basically putting forth that the artist is like the bird that watches. And that really resonated with me at the time. You can imagine, like, there I was, cloistered out at the end of a dirt road, pursuing this anachronistic craft and very earnestly looking at the world around me and the pots that we were making and trying to figure out what it was all about. You know, I really conceived of myself as someone who had tried to step outside the river of time and from its banks observe what was going past so that I could make sense of it all, with the aspiration that I would take that understanding at some point and add my voice to a chorus of artists that would serve as the soul of society. You know, that was my 22-year-old aspiration, which I wanted to be that bird that watches, right? That made a lot of sense. So that's the first vignette. The second one comes from the chapter of life that I'm in currently. It started about 6 years ago when I moved up to Asheville to work with my current business partners, Alex and Connie. And at the time, we didn't really know what exactly we wanted to do. We knew we wanted to do something together, and we knew we wanted to do something that could grow to include a larger group. But beyond that, the details were sort of fuzzy. And so we bravely or naively stepped off into the unknown. And lucky for us, the details have really firmed up since then. We're now this growing group of 45 people who manufacture and market and sell dinnerware on a small industrial scale. And so what we're doing now, it's related to what I was doing as an apprentice. You know, I'm still involved in pottery, broadly speaking, but at the same time, it's paradigmatically different. It's a huge shift for me personally. And one of these big personal changes is that I no longer make pottery. I no longer am throwing on the wheel. My business card now says CFO, which I still put in air quotes 5 years later, because like serious imposter syndrome, you know? But you can imagine like the day-to-day life of an apprentice potter and a financial analyst are very different. And one way I try to make sense of that change is to use this image of those two birds again. So whereas before I was this meditative bird that watched and was trying to make sense of the world around me, I now much more strongly identify with this image of this stressed out little bird that eats. My work as CFO at East Fork, air quotes again, yeah. It asked me to routinely engage with and kind of quantitatively analyze this economic system that, for better for worse, provides for the collective physical body of our society. Let me explain. The East Fork's this small node in this big economic system that generates and allocates the resources that people use to secure food and housing and transportation and healthcare. You know, all these things that are necessitated by our physical bodies. But the tension of engaging with that is we're all aware that the system that we depend on also often misallocates those resources or denies access to those resources in a way that it can be a deep source of suffering as well. And so it's a complicated thing to, on a day-to-day basis, come up against this system and try to make sense of it. And so that's all to say that's kind of why I identify with this little stressed out bird that eats. I'm engaged in this world of resource, on a day-to-day basis. So when I relate those two vignettes to people that I've just met, like explain those two chapters of my life that I'm moving through, one common rejoinder will be for people to ask, well, don't you miss making pottery now that you're behind a computer all day? Don't you miss that creative outlet? And I've never really had the wherewithal or maybe the courage or the time to answer that question fully and honestly. Because the truth is that I don't miss making pots. I don't miss that creative outlet. But it's not because I didn't deeply value that work and find a lot of meaning in it when I was doing it. Instead, I've discovered that in living through these two states, being this kind of dreamy meditative artist and being this more hard-nosed financial analyst, that my intention in both of those states, the thing towards which I aspired, has been the exact same. The goal has been the same. And so this is where I'm going to ask y'all to bring that concept of symmetry back into your thinking. So just like that ink blot that I was talking about at the beginning of the talk, that in one way of seeing can be this image of two opposites that are opposed to each other, but in another way can be seen as this symmetrical whole of two pieces that are put in harmony with one another by being oriented towards the fold down the middle of the page. So too can you conceive of these stereotypically oppositional states of being a right-brained artist or a left-brained analyst as being in symmetry with one another, both oriented towards one shared central goal. And so then the question is, what is that shared central goal, right? And for me personally, the experience has been, and the feeling has been that in both of those two states, on my best days, my highest aspiration has been to seduce myself and the people around me into a deeper and more complicated love of the reality in which we find ourselves. That's the central fold in this metaphor. That's the thing towards which I've aspired and oriented myself. And in some ways, I think this intention is easier to see on the creative side of things, especially maybe in this crowd. We all have had the experience of standing in front of a beautiful painting is to be kind of seduced into the lusciousness of the world, and drawn inwards. But even art that's not beautiful, art that's challenging, can still have that same effect. It can break off fresh facets of reality that were previously inaccessible to us and leave us with this feeling that we're in on some new secret with God or the universe. It draws us in. But what can that intention look like on the non-creative side of things? And this is the part of the talk that I kind of have the hardest time articulating. And when I've rehearsed it in front of friends, this is where it kind of goes off the rails. So we'll see how this goes. But when I'm thinking about what I'm trying to say, like what it actually is to be this little bird that eats, I think the best way to illustrate that is using one last anecdote. So at East Fork, every Tuesday, Thursday, we all get together and have these big group lunches. A group of 2 or 3 volunteers will cook lunch for the other 30 or so folks who are in the building that day. And we get together at this big long table. It's like a 30-foot long table. And we eat this food that's been prepared by our team off of these plates that we've all made together. And it's this very meaningful part of our day. It's got its roots in the apprenticeship system that Alex and I studied under, but also deeper, just primal human roots. Sharing meals together is a pretty basic human thing, right? But I think it serves as a microcosm of one of our highest intentions at East Fork, which is to enrich the lives that touch the manufacture and use of the pots that we make, and to provide an occasion for people to come together to a common table to eat and to be fed, both literally and metaphorically speaking. And so when I'm thinking about what I'm trying to say, like what is this bird that eats? This is the image that I keep coming back to. I think the bird that eats is engaged with understanding its own needs and the needs of the people around it so that it can serve those needs in a way that brings people together. I think the bird that eats is less concerned with novelty and freshness and meaning and revelation and more concerned with stewardship and caretaking. And so when I think back to this central goal of seducing ourselves into a deeper love of the world in which we find ourselves, I can think of no more powerful tool than stewardship and caretaking, When I was thinking about what I could say to this group of people that gets together once a month and swears an oath to creativity, that's what I came up with. Basically, I wanted to reinforce that oath and say, yes, it's a beautiful thing to commit ourselves to a creative pursuit where we break off fresh facets of the world for each other to kind of draw each other in with. But I wanted to caution against too narrowly defining what a creative pursuit could look like. Or maybe more specifically, failing to acknowledge that creative pursuit can exist in symmetry with lots of other pursuits that orient towards a more central goal, perhaps. Because in reality, we will all be asked to exist as the bird that watches and the bird that eats in equal measure across our lifetime. And I've found that for me personally, my own mental health is sort of dependent on me being able to actualize both of those things and apply them symmetrically and acknowledge that symmetrical center point. So it's been a treat getting to talk to all of you. Thanks.